Hi, and welcome back to the 50/50 Project, where every week I talk through a really long list that's made up of one thing I've learned for each year I've lived. It's a beautiful spring evening here in Indianapolis. Peony season is suddenly in full swing in the Hoosier State, and today we're counting our way up again. We're on thing number 5, write more odes than elegies. I think I've mentioned already that I used to teach. I taught in the English department of a big, bustling public university, and I loved it. I taught a lot of stuff, but my favorite class I think that I ever taught was a poetry course, a survey course. And I had set that class up so we weren't reading by time or type of poems, we were reading by theme. So we might spend a day reading poems about the seasons or war or breakups. And we might read a breakup poem from 1920 right alongside one from 1765. Or we might read a sonnet alongside a piece of free verse or something from one of the beat poets right after something from John Donne. It was so much fun. I loved that class so much. And one section of that class was especially beloved to me because I actually taught them the term right after my father died. I had buried him 4 days before the fall semester started, and the class was already set up that we would spend 2 weeks on death as a theme. The good death, the untimely death, conceptions of the afterlife, stuff like that. And I was open with them about what had just happened and sort of the psychological space in which I was reading those poems myself. And as it sometimes happens, they were in turn more willing, I think, to dive into the readings themselves. And that class and the poems we read then were a really big solace to me. So anyway, the idea of odes and elegies and these two types of poems as a metaphor for how we talk to and about each other, or don't, all of that probably threads back to that time for me in some ways. So when I talk about odes and elegies here, I'll admit that I'm kind of using a stretchy general definition, so poetry purists, please don't come for me. But the thing about an ode that I want to seize on here is that often, not always, but quite often, they're a kind of direct address to something, a way to talk to a person or a thing or some other entity. I'll go right to Keats, who in Ode on a Grecian Urn speaks directly to the urn itself. Thou silent form, thou shalt remain. He's talking to this vase, speaking right to it. And the same thing with Shelley's To a Skylark. Hail to thee, blithe spirit, speaking directly to the bird. Not everything considered an ode operates in quite that way with that kind of very direct address. But I think there's a certain element of proximity to an ode, an element of presence and shared space. And when you write an ode, again, you're writing to something or someone. So the subject tends to remain within earshot in a way. It's more of a living, listening presence in an ode. And that shifts when you move from ode into elegy, with the subject sort of moving away, out of reach. An elegy is generally a lament written for someone dead or something lost. And while it can still vividly describe a person or a place, a thing or an event, that description kind of comes from the other side of remembrance. There's an absence at the center of the poem instead of a presence. Probably the most famous example is Thomas Gray's Elegy written in a country churchyard. The poet describes the graveyard itself, the memorials within it, and he talks about the people who were buried there and who they once were but are no longer. He describes the things they once did but no longer do, or the lives they once lived but no longer live. So a simple way I think of it, and admittedly it's an oversimple way, but I think it's still serviceable, is that you write an ode to someone, but you write an elegy about them because they've slipped away from you. They're sort of past all hearing and past all registry. But what I want to say today about odes and elegies isn't specifically about poetry at all. It's just about the ways we communicate and the unbridgeable gap that is or isn't there when we finally decide to speak to and about each other. I'm talking about conversations and thank you letters and text messages and birthday cards, and poems only really factor metaphorically here. I think all these different kinds of odes are both easier and harder to write than elegies. Easier to write in a psychological sense maybe because they don't require us to be in the throes of loss or lament to write them. But they're harder to write when we're dealing with tough issues or disagreements or rifts because they invite a response. And that response might not be the one we want. They might open up the door to conflict or unkindness or rejection or culpability, things that we're not prepared to contend with. In some ways, it's harder to write an ode when you might get one back, right? Or when you might really want one back and instead you get nothing. Because our odes are often written to the living. They are potentially messy. They rock the boat, they invite uncertainty, they cause anxiety. Elegies, on the other hand, are also both harder and easier. Harder because the prep for them hurts more. Fate takes something away that you loathe to lose, or circumstances divide you from someone dear, and that sucks. And communicating about that can sometimes sting as much as the experience itself, sometimes at least. But they're easier because we get to be alone in that narrative. We get to shape the story and we get to end it. It can be more peaceful there in the space that divides us from that which is already irretrievably lost. So sometimes it feels simpler to keep our odes to ourselves, and then eventually they may age into elegies. And I'm not here to shit on elegies. There's a lot to be said to speaking of the loved and the lost, both as an honor to them and as a catharsis for us. I gave my father's eulogy, and I think that was one of the best choices I've ever made. It felt right to do it in the moment, and in the years since then, it has comforted me to know that instead of a generic litany said over his coffin, the people who were there actually heard something about who he really was and how much he actually meant to us. So, yeah, when the occasion arises, meet it. Write your elegy. Share it with those it might help or comfort, or, lift it up in the hope it floats off to wherever those kinds of things float off to. What I am saying, though, I think is, write more odes. And I don't mean this indiscriminately or unconditionally. I am not here to tell you anything about who you should or shouldn't write an ode to. I'm not here to talk to you about what you should do or what you owe to the family member who traumatized you or the teacher who scarred you or whatever. I'm not saying you owe anybody anything. But I think for myself, with regard to the good people in my life, the kind people, the trustworthy people, the contributory people, those who've earned thanks or praise, those who are worth fighting for or negotiating with or apologizing to, those people and only those. I wish I had written them more odes instead of waiting for them to become elegies sometimes. And that has actually happened to me. It has happened to me recently, and it seems to happen more as I age up. Very recently, a very dear friend of mine became sort of standoffish. And rather than risking another ode, I waited and I watched, and I worried about being rebuffed again if I continued to reach out. I worried about the conflict that might arise from direct address and opportunity for dialogue. And so I waited. And eventually I found myself writing an elegy instead. So now I find myself recommitting to writing more odes than elegies. And I hope I'm more true to that goal in the future than I have been in the past. And bracketing romantic stuff, which I don't really know if I'm talking about here because, my God, what a morass to wade into. But in terms of friendships and mentorships and such things, I don't think I have ever really had a long-term regret about an ode that I offered that missed the mark or was, returned unopened, so to speak. It's the messages I didn't send that keep me up at night. So write more odes than elegies. More Facebook messages, more letters, more postcards, more scripts in which you press lovingly into things that are hard or scary or rage-inducing. And again, not with everyone, but when it's worth it, with those who deserve it. Okay, execution score, 5 out of 10. I'm working on it. I'm trying to learn the lessons that life offers me, but I'm too often walled up within myself or afraid of entanglement or embarrassed by effusiveness of any sort. But, 5 points for self-awareness and continued effort, I suppose. Okay, I think that's enough for today. If there's an ode or an elegy you find yourself wanting or needing to write, I wish you good luck. Thanks for spending some time with me today, and I'll be back next week with thing number 6.